Hi, good evening again. All right, well, I gotta admit that doing these Facebook Live presentations is sometimes a little harder than it looks. Still learning how to use this technology and be able to make presentations without losing the train of thought. Anywho, so this topic of identity is actually something I've been considering and kind of reflecting on actually all week long. And there were a few things that I was wanting to say, so that's why I'm making this part two presentation, so I can go a little bit more in depth and in detail. So, the concept of our identity is, of course, something that's very foundational to how people view themselves in various circumstances. One example of this is, as I had my little friendly oranges, I'm playing with food again here. Sometimes I made the example of how sometimes doctors are kind of taught to split apart the person and focus on, in the case of neurology, maybe the brain and the nervous system, maybe focus only on the heart, on the kidneys, or on other aspects of the single. Or somebody comes in for a broken ankle and all they see is broken ankle. They don't see the context of how did that happen? What else is going on in the person's life? And sometimes you don't really care. You just want to, fix the ankle and move on. But sometimes it's good to be able to see the rest of it. Anywho, in the same way that sometimes the medical profession kind of carves up the individual into little bits and pieces, oftentimes we sometimes will do that to ourselves as well. And one example of that is in the realm of diseases in particular. For example, somebody who has a disease called heart disease or cancer, they may take that one aspect of whatever is going on in their entire being and really tend to focus on it. And the mind has this funny tendency that whatever it tends to focus on, it tends to get bigger and bigger. So, in the case of our little orange example, let's pretend that the orange doesn't like that little spot. Maybe it's some sort of perceived defect of some sort, whether it's a physical wart or other aspect, some habit that they don't happen to like. Sometimes when people get obsessed with their weight, they don't like the number, and so it's something that they focus on a lot. And so, anyway, whatever the perceived defect is, sometimes it has a very powerful negative focusing factor on the mind. And just as I'm kind of noticing on here, it's kind of like it gets zoomed in. The mind focuses on it, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it just kind of sort of swallows up everything else that's going on about it. And I mean, obviously, if I go too far in there, trying to figure out how to get onto the camera there, then basically the rest of the beauty of the orange kind of gets lost in translation. Sometimes that happens when people are part of a particular job category. I've seen it several times where people are let's say they're getting ready to retire from a job that they might have held for, maybe 15, 20 years or something, or they're basically getting separated from that particular job, and now they've got to create a whole new life for themselves. And it's a big transition, and understandably, very often people start to feel a little bit lost because a large part of their identity was wrapped up in that particular job aspect. And so that's one of the reasons why remembering some of the bigger picture kind of things, in other words, remembering there's so many more aspects to oneself rather than just a disease or just a body part or just an organ or just a little, I don't know, some sort of spot that may or may not be a defect, depending on how you look at it. And being able to tap into some of those other greater resources. Generally speaking, people are very, very dynamic, and there are a lot of aspects to ourselves that are very joyous and very pleasant and peaceful. And when we focus on something and really, really, really zoom in on some little thingamabob like I was demonstrating in my my demonstration here, then it's something that sometimes can cause people to feel a little bit down or depressed, because really, if all you see is the defects in the object and in what you consider to be yourself, well, then you're missing out on a lot of the other aspects. And basically, remembering some of the other aspects can help people kind of redefine themselves. So let's say they retire from or separate or move on to a new job. Well, now they might redefine themselves in a different avenue. Maybe they look for a place to volunteer, for example. I'm just throwing out some examples. Where it turns into a negative thing is when people put so much value on themselves in one particular aspect, then sometimes if they lose that job or that particular aspect that they value, sometimes they forget that there's more to them, and sometimes they feel as though they themselves have lost their value, which I would like to argue is not the case on there. Or let's say that that an aspect of the physical body has become taken away. Maybe somebody has become an amputee, or maybe they are diabetic and they've lost a toe or something, or maybe even something more kidney, other aspect. And certainly, if a part of the body is lost, it does not mean that the entire being has lost the value of itself. Another way of looking at this, for example, is if you ever watch how parents take care of a newborn baby. That's one of the pleasures of residency, actually, is I got a chance to be there as mothers and fathers who were welcoming new people into the world for the very, very first time. And the amount of absolute love that you see in these mothers and fathers' eyes as they hold their baby. I mean, yeah, I go into these mothers' rooms at god-awful times in the morning, like 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, because we had to write reports. And, and sometimes these mothers would be just sitting there gazing at their brand new baby child who comes into this world in such beauty and innocence and love. And, that baby's not doing anything. They're not, they're sleeping, they're eating, they're pooping. That's about it for the first little while on there. And yet that baby is so valued. And sometimes, as people go through life and they start to identify with these little aspects of whatever their personality is, or their job, or their body, or other, I'd like to say, somewhat more superficial aspects of themselves, they forget that intrinsic value in just being there and being human, and that they are worthy of being loved, that they are worthy of, loving others, and so forth. And part of that is because we identify with these other things so much sometimes that we forget those more deeper, like to say bigger truths or something along those lines. Another aspect of the identity that I wanted to talk about, in addition to how folks can identify with physical aspects or job aspects, is sometimes people identify with certain emotions. And just as a physical thing can really cause people to zoom in on that particular part, sometimes people identify so much with a particular thought or a particular emotion that, just like that little spot, the emotion now kind of takes over, their entire view, and it becomes very difficult to see beyond that particular emotion. I gotta say, sometimes fear can be a very powerful one, and other emotions have a tendency to similarly be all absorbing in those sections. Alrighty, so one other thing I'd like to introduce is a certain way of looking at life in the world that I've learned as a part of my meditation tradition, and that is this. And I'm going to hold it up here, and I can hide behind it a little bit. But basically, this is a little bit of a roadmap for a way of looking at ourselves in a slightly different manner than what you might have been used to in the past. Basically, I'll go through it briefly. So this is the physical body, as I've been pointing to with my little orange here. So there's the physical body looking out at the world, and it just so happens it's the perfect size orange there. Looking out at the world through the senses, and we're doing things out there, and impressions are coming into us. There's the breath, which actually is a really nice way of tapping into the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Big words, sorry, but basically what that means is we have a type of nervous system in our body that is mostly not under our conscious control, except that we can tap into it and help to regulate it by regulating your breath. And if you think about it, a lot of people really can't sit here and think, okay, I want my heart rate to be 52 or 73 or something. Because it's not like we're sitting there consciously, trying to beat our hearts. However, the breath is something that we have a conscious control over, or that we can have a conscious control over. And so it's a beautiful way of being able to tap into some of those relaxation patterns, to tap into that rest and digest function, or when we're about to run away from a tiger or a tough boss or another situation, the breath changes, and also the nervous system changes, and so we're able to control the inhalation, exhalation in a way that we're not able to really tap into other parts of the nervous system consciously. So anyway, that's why the breath is this beautiful connection between the body and the mind. It generally is that when the breath is nice and smooth, that the mind has a tendency to kind of settle down. So this is the conscious mind that we use to chat with each other, that I'm using to communicate with you now. Just underneath that is part of the unconscious, called the active unconscious. And what that refers to is that first layer of processing. For example, the imagery or the thoughts that come before those things are expressed. Sometimes the dream state can be thought of as part of that active, unprocessed, processing part of it. Deeper to that is the latent unconscious, and that's kind of where the deeper impressions lie. So when I look at something, I might have a memory of, oh, well, this is an orange. Well, how on earth do I know that it's an orange? And there's a memory trace kind of deep into this area that basically says orange, and it comes out, and I can sit here and imagine an orange. So I think a little orange bubble going off in my head here. And then my conscious mind in the outside world here says, ah, look at that, that's an orange. Awesome. And so basically, impressions are constantly going into and feeding into our deeper kind of really unconscious things. And there's a lot of different things that shape our sense of who we are that are buried kind of deep in there. For example, when it comes to food patterns, sometimes people think of folks who eat plants only as being a little kooky, and not that, or that they have other impressions. Well, some of those things may be coming in from other people. For example, if it's not part of the culture to eat mostly plants, the person might get a little bit marginalized. Or sometimes if it is seen in a movie or something, There's oftentimes in these comedy movies, they'll have a Thanksgiving scene and everybody's enjoying the turkey except for those two vegetarians who are, absolutely shocked. How is it that they could eat a turkey on Thanksgiving? Something along those lines. Well, a lot of that is suggestions that are kind of given to us by other people, and they kind of filter into our mind and kind of lodge deeper into these areas. And there's a section over here that's just kind of represented as a question mark to imply that perhaps underneath the body and the conscious mind and all of this other stuff, maybe there's something just a little bit more subtle and more deep, for example, peace or joy or love or light or I don't know, whatever you want to use to express it, and without really giving a name to anything deep in there. That's why it's kind of a question mark in this model. So, anyway, the part of the question is, well, where do we get some of the ideas that we hold about ourselves? And a lot of that starts off in early childhood. For example, when that mother is holding that little tiny baby and loving on it, one of the first things the mom says is, basically saying the name of the baby. And so the name for people is very, very deeply rooted into these deeper layers. The baby is born a boy or a girl most of the time. Some exceptions, but we'll talk about that later. And basically, on a very, very beginning basis, well, society has all sorts of things that it attributes to what does it mean to be a boy or a girl in this particular society. So if a young boy is playing with dolls, for example, and then basically they may be told by their parents, oh, no, you're a boy, you should not play with those dolls. Or conversely, if a young girl is running around in the backyard, climbing trees and playing with cars or something, then the parents might say, oh, no, you're a girl, you shouldn't be doing that particular thing. And so a lot of times these external suggestions from others get internalized. And sometimes advertisers play on these societal things as well. For example, you might have noticed cigarette commercials in the day. They would have, like, the Marlboro Man would be this big, strong, strapping guy riding a horse around in the wilderness, as if to say, associate this product with this societal desire to be manly or something. Sometimes people will look at fashion magazines, for example. I saw a beautiful presentation recently where somebody took a fashion magazine, and essentially it was all about the girl's hair and follow these tips to get the guy and all sorts of things. And this is supposed to be for teenagers, And she said, well, gosh, what if we redesigned this magazine and they put a cover on it of a young girl that had just won the science fair, and instead of how to look good, it was how to be good and serve other people, and all sorts of other things, healthy eating and so forth. That was on the redesigned, reimagined cover. And so part of the thing is how often do people we just kind of very often unquestioningly take in some of the things that are said. One of the beautiful things about knowledge of the mind and how some of these things happen is sometimes people get a sense of being able to, I guess I should say, re-examine themselves or re-examine, well, where are these ideas? How did I get the idea that that I'm supposed to be this or that, or what if I don't quite fit into one of these little boxes that that society likes to put people into? And it also gives a little bit of sense of being able to watch or witness some of these ideas instead of, for example, latching on to an emotion and continuously identifying with that emotion, remembering that there's something deeper or more peaceful that's inside of all of us, I think. Uh, or being able to even just witness and watch the emotion and learn to be able to just kind of step back from whatever it is, a little bit, and just watch as it kind of comes and rises and then goes back to wherever it came from on there. Those kinds of techniques or tools or just self-awareness can be very, very helpful in helping with maintaining mental calmness or equanimity, and also more of a sense of joy, as some of these things are able to just not be able to control you quite as much as they were, because sometimes if you see where something is coming from, it gives the ability to say, oh, well, maybe that's not really true. For example, sometimes children are taught at a very young age. Sometimes there's negative statements that are said in different households that the children then kind of internalize. For example, some parents might say, you're a troublemaker, or you're stupid, or other kinds of things. And that kind of gets sunk in, and then sometimes the child then repeats some of those things of themselves, and they become to believe it. And then later on, when they start to be able to re-examine and see, oh, well, that came in because this other person, in the role of parent or brother or sister or other peers, for example, other children that are surrounding that individual might be bullying that child or something. There's a lot of different ways in which these influences come in, or even sometimes part of the greater culture. One of the things that I've been learning about is, for example, that in certain ethnic cultures, sometimes there's a smart shaming that can happen. If a sorry for the distraction there. So sometimes if there's a African American child, and of course I don't have any direct experience of this myself, but so I've heard it said, that is performing too well in school, occasionally, sometimes the peers or the people around them might tell that person, "Oh my gosh, you're acting too white, or you're not conforming to their expectations." So anyway, so as people are forming these self-identities and identifying with these various aspects, then basically it can very much control or influence or shape how is it that they go through life, how is it that they relate to other human beings of the same, for example, ethnicity or others, or even how they relate to themselves, and what kinds of things are they telling themselves with it. And so, anyway, some of these things, there's just all different ways in which we are constantly getting bombarded by suggestions. Different fashion magazines, for example, telling people, oh, you've got to be a little bit thinner, or you got to be a little fitter. If you're looking at a men's magazine, it might focus on all the great muscles and things along those lines, very superficial characteristics in a sense. And when we compare ourselves to what we see, maybe on somebody else's Facebook feed, or compare ourselves to what we see in the magazines, sometimes that can leave a sense of not accepting themselves or ourselves for who we are and our authenticity, who it is that's inside that's trying to come out and express to the world. And so that's where different things like labels and so forth can come in. And as we become aware of these different thoughts that might be coming up in the inside, again, that can influence what we're willing to try, what we believe we can try in regards to health behaviors and mental health as well. Just kind of our own inner sanity and happiness when it comes to everything. So those are a few additional things that I did want to bring out that I kind of didn't come out earlier tonight. So again, I want to keep it maybe not too long this evening. So more to come, and we'll be having some different presentations in different weeks. I'm thinking that my next presentation is going to be on some intestinal health kinds of things. I've got a few things that I want to put on there, and if I have any other things on tonight's topic, then you might just see another little video presentation on some aspect or another that usually after I hit the finish button, all of a sudden the brain goes, oh yeah, I forgot to say, this on there. So as I said before, this entire website is still a work in process, learning how to speak extemporaneously, so to say, on the camera, and also giving all of y'all something to think about, and hopefully something that you might mull over on your own and maybe talk about with somebody else, or obviously you can comment in the comment section down below. And again, more to come. Thank you for part 2 of the topic of identity, and have a good night. Bye-bye.